What happens when a 72-year-old black farmer gets arrested on his own land? Without a warrant, without a crime, and without a chance to speak. This isn't just about cornfields and handcuffs. It's about the roots of racism buried deep in American soil. And one granddaughter's fight to dig them up may just change everything. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The morning sun spread its gold across the endless fields of Tula, Georgia, a sleepy town where silence wasn't always. The corn swayed gently in the wind, as if unaware of what was coming, oblivious to the sirens that hadn't yet broken the stillness, to the dust that would soon rise on the gravel road, and to the sound of boots on dry earth that had known both sweat and blood. Eli Mercer, a 72-year-old black farmer, stood in his boots, worn and cracked like the hands that had tilled his land for decades. His back ached, but he moved with dignity, planting row after row of sweet corn. The land had been his father's and his father's before that. It was more than soil. It was memory, inheritance, and a claim to dignity in a world that too often forgot the price of brown hands growing white wealth. It didn't hear the engines at first, only the sudden stillness of birds that had taken flight. Then came the grind of tires, the rattle of radios, and the shouted commands. By the time Eli turned toward the commotion, the police were already stepping through his gate. Local sheriffs, not faces he'd known from church or the general store. These were state agents, armored and unsmiling, their eyes trained and hollow. Hands where we can see them. Eli raised them slowly. His voice was calm. This is my land. They didn't listen. They didn't ask. A young officer with too much fear and too little wisdom stepped forward, slapped handcuffs on Eli's wrists and shoved him toward the patrol car. The cornfield watched in silence. So did the neighbor's dog. So did the white woman across the fence line who ducked behind her porch screen as if she didn't see. The charge vague, a suspicion of involvement in agricultural theft. Though no one had reported a thing missing. There were no victims, only assumptions. And Eli, with his calloused hands and proud silence, had become an easy target. What made it worse was the whisper, the kind that travels through small southern towns faster than the morning fog. He must have done something, they said. The police wouldn't just show up like that. But deep down, even those who repeated it knew it wasn't true. Eli had never missed church, never spoken a harsh word in public. He grew food and paid his taxes. His only crime was being a black man on good land. At the police station, they took his mug shot. The flash of the camera caught the deep lines on his face, etched not by age, but by generations of watching justice bend around people like him. The sergeant looked uneasy, glancing at the arrest sheet, then at Eli. "You sure you got the right guy?" he mumbled to the arresting officer. But the officer shrugged. "We had a tip. Besides, the system will sort it out." Eli didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had lived long enough to know that silence is sometimes the most powerful protest. Word of the arrest. But some neighbors offered cautious sympathy. "It's a mistake. He's a good man." Others stayed silent, unwilling to challenge the force that wore badges and carried guns. But there was one voice that wouldn't stay quiet. Maya, Eli's 28-year-old granddaughter, civil rights lawyer from Atlanta who had spent her childhood running barefoot through Eli's cornrows and listening to stories of endurance and fire. When she received the call, Maya didn't cry. She packed her bag, drove 3 hours without stopping, and arrived at the station with a briefcase full of law and fury. "I want to see the arrest warrant," she demanded. Her voice cracked like thunder. The officer hesitated, flinched even, but handed it over. It was thin. No real evidence, no victim, just a report filed by an anonymous caller, later revealed to be the same woman who once tried to buy Eli's land and was politely told it wasn't for sale. Maya's eyes narrowed. She knew the game. She'd read about it in law school textbooks and seen it in courtrooms. But now it had arrived on her grandfather's doorstep. That night, Maya sat beside Eli in his holding cell. He looked tired but not broken. "Granddad," she said softly, "I'm getting you out." Eli smiled faintly. "Don't rush. Let them feel the weight of it. Let them write the report, fill in the blanks, and realize they've got nothing. I got time. What I don't have is fear." Outside, the stars glowed over the Georgia sky. But beneath that quiet shimmer was the sound of a story unfolding, one that would expose more than a mistaken arrest. It would dig up old roots, shine light on rotting systems, and remind everyone watching that dignity once threatened does not go quietly into the night. And in the silence of a jail cell, where an old man refused to be humiliated, a movement was beginning to stir. By sunrise the next day, Tula's police station had become more than a jail. It had become the epicenter of a quiet reckoning. The fluorescent lights inside buzzed faintly above Eli Mercer's cell. He sat on the thin bench, his posture calm, hands folded in his lap as if he were back on his porch, waiting for the cornbread to finish baking. But behind that stillness brewed something more potent than rage clarity. Across town, Maya was already on her second cup of black coffee, scrolling through legal documents and fielding phone calls from colleagues who'd caught wind of the arrest. Though no national headlines had surfaced yet, she knew it was only a matter of time. The sheriff's office, in trying to silence a man, had unknowingly awakened a woman with a voice sharpened by both the courtroom and personal legacy. At the center of the report was Officer Ryden Hole, a recently transferred deputy from a neighboring county. His personnel file, which Maya had managed to request through an old contact, revealed a pattern. 3 past complaints for unwarranted stops of black drivers, 1 quiet suspension, and a recommendation for reassignment. Without public disclosure, this wasn't his first mistake. It was just the first one that had the misfortune of landing on Eli Mercer's soil. In the town diner, whispers fluttered over biscuits and gravy. Some said it was all a misunderstanding. Others spoke in lowered voices about how Hole had always seemed off, but no one dared say the word that hung like smoke in the air: racism. Until the word was treated like a ghost present, undeniable, but never spoken aloud. Meanwhile, inside the sheriff's office, a different conversation was happening. Sheriff Byron Keller, a man who had served Tula for over 20 years, sat across from Hole with furrowed brows and a clenched jaw. "You're telling me this is based on a tip from a woman who had a personal grudge?" he asked, voice low. Hole shrugged. "She said the crops didn't belong to him. So just saw trucks late at night. Did you verify that before you sent a team out there? It's procedure to act fast on agricultural theft." Keller cut him. "It's procedure to act smart. You stormed an old man's property without evidence, with force. And now this town's about to eat itself alive over your damn mistake." But Hole didn't back down. There was something colder in his tone. Something that barely concealed his disdain. People like him always find a way to hide something. That was the moment Keller saw it. Not just error, but intention. Later that day, Maya filed an official request for Eli's release, citing unlawful arrest, lack of probable cause, and racial bias. Her petition was swift and sharp, the kind of language that left no room for denial. But it wasn't the legal jargon that stirred discomfort. It was the enclosed affidavit signed by a former Sterling County officer detailing Holt's discriminatory conduct. From 2 years prior, the document didn't just raise questions. Through a map of systemic rot. Outside the courthouse, small clusters of townsfolk had started to gather. Some held signs. Others simply stood. One sign read, "Farming isn't a crime." Another, "Justice for Eli." And though the crowd was still modest, it grew each hour. Inside the holding cell, Eli had been given back his reading glasses. A deputy, younger and clearly rattled, had slipped them through the bars. "I'm sorry, Mr. Mercer," the boy had whispered. "I didn't sign up for this." Eli nodded. "None of us did, son, but here we are." By evening, Maya stood before a judge. Her words were steady, her back straight. "My grandfather has been treated not as a citizen, but as a suspicion made flesh. This arrest isn't about a crime. About a perception rooted in race, age, and the arrogance of unchecked power." The judge, an older man named Reuter Boone, studied her. He had known Eli for this. They hadn't spoken much, but Boone remembered the years Eli had donated sweet corn to the town pantry, helped repair storm-damaged roofs, mentored young boys who had no fathers. He cleared his throat. "Bail is set at 0. Mr. Mercer is to be released immediately, and I'm ordering a review of this entire incident by the state's Independent Oversight Board." As Maya walked back toward the cell to retrieve her grandfather, she passed Holt in the hallway. He sneered slightly. "That'll teach you people to play the race card." She stopped cold, turned slowly. "It's not a card," she said, her voice a razor wrapped in velvet. "It's a reality, one you clearly never learned how to face." That night, as the news spread, Maya and Eli sat under the same stars that had witnessed his arrest. The cornfields were still glowing silver in the moonlight. Maya handed him a glass of sweet tea. "You okay?" she asked. Eli took a sip. "I'm not angry," he said softly. "I'm tired. Tired that after all these years, the color of my skin still speaks louder than the content of my character." Maya's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. "Then let's make sure it stops here." He looked at her proud. "That's what your grandmother used to say." In the distance, someone had hung a small banner across the gate of Eli's land. It read in bold letters, "This land stays his." And for the first time in a long time, the fields no longer felt alone. By morning, the quiet town of Tula was anything but quiet. What had begun as whispers over diner counters and murmurs in church pews had erupted into open dialogue. Some whispered in shame, others shouted in outrage. Maya stood in front of her grandfather's porch, her phone lighting up with calls from journalists, civil rights attorneys, and even a few city council members who'd never once set foot on Eli Mercer's land. The cornfields behind her swayed gently in the wind, tall and defiant like Eli himself. Eli hadn't spoken much since his release, but his silence wasn't one of defeat. It was the quiet of a man choosing his moment, gathering strength like water behind a dam. He'd seen this before in different forms with different uniforms. His father had been dragged off this same land in 1963 during a fabricated dispute over voting rights. Eli had been a boy, then hiding behind a barrel of seed potatoes, watching white officers mock his father's accent and chain his hands like he was nothing more than livestock. But even then, young Eli learned something vital. Land remembers, and so do the people who work it. Maya stood beside him that morning, a stack of documents in her hands and fire in her heart. "Grandpa, I'm going to file a civil rights violation case against Holda, department, and the county." Eli nodded once, but his eyes didn't move from the "Do it not just for me, baby," he said, voice low. "Do it for every brown-skinned hand that planted something in this soil and got spat on for daring to dream it would." Word traveled fast. That afternoon, an unexpected figure showed up at the farm, Reverend Josiah Carter, now nearing 80, but still walking with the same proud gait that had led marches in Selma. He embraced Eli without words. They hadn't spoken in years. But history doesn't fade. Just lies dormant until summoned. Reverend Carter stood before a growing crowd at the edge of Eli's property that evening, Bible in hand, but voice grounded not in scripture alone, rather in memory. This land is stitched with the sweat of black men and women who dared to call it. What happened to Brother Eli ain't just a mistake, it's a pattern. One they thought we'd stop noticing if they wore suits instead of hoods. Maya organized a community meeting on the same soil where Eli had been arrested. Neighbors came, teachers, farmers, retired postal workers, teenagers who'd only heard stories of racism in textbooks and thought it was a relic of a different era. One by one, people shared stories. A Latina woman named Rosa talked about being denied a loan, despite perfect credit. A black high school senior described being followed around the pharmacy every time he wore his hoodie. This wasn't just Eli's story. It was theirs too. And then Eli stood up. He looked smaller than he once was. But when he spoke, his voice was larger than the field behind him. They didn't come for me because I broke a law. They came for me because I broke their illusion that a black man in his 60s couldn't own land this rich. They don't arrest us because we're criminals. Arrest us because we're proof they're wrong. A long silence followed. Of discomfort, but reverence. Maya reached out to the state NACP. And within 48 hours their spokesperson arrived offering legal aid and demanding a federal review of the Tula Sheriff's Department. Suddenly, the incident wasn't local anymore. It was national. Headlines shifted from elderly man mistakenly detained to systemic racism in Tula, one farmer stand. But not everyone welcomed the scrutiny. Someone painted a red X on Eli's barn. A tire was slashed. A neighbor who once offered eggs every Sunday now crossed the road rather than wave. Still, Eli stood his ground. Literally. He spent every morning walking the rows of his cornfields as he always had. Fear doesn't feed a crop, he told Maya. Discipline does. And faith. When Officer Holt was put on administrative leave, the town split in two. Some called it justice, others called it overreaction. But the truth was simpler than either side would admit. A man had been humiliated for the crime of being black. And dignified in a place where only one of those traits was acceptable. A local reporter interviewed Maya on the front porch. "What do you hope to gain?" he asked. She didn't hesitate. Not vengeance, visibility, not just for my grandfather, for every person who's been quietly dismissed, disrespected, discarded. She paused. "We don't want a parade. We want policy. We want accountability." The roots of resistance were no longer underground. They'd broken through, reaching skyward like stalks of corn defying drought. And in that soil heavy with injustice and history, something else was beginning to grow. Not rage, but resolve. That night, as Maya and Eli sat on the porch, watching fireflies flicker in the dark, he said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "They thought they buried me," he whispered. "But they forgot I was a seed. And this time the harvest would be justice." The courthouse in Monroe, just an hour east of Tula, had never seen so many people lined up outside its steps. Not for a celebrity trial or a politician scandal, but for a 67-year-old black farmer with calloused hands and stories deep as riverbeds. Eli Mercer wasn't dressed in anything grand, just his Sunday denim jacket and clean boots. But that morning, as he entered the courtroom, flanked by Maya and Reverend Carter, his presence turned those polished marble floors into sacred. The hearing wasn't a criminal trial. Not yet. It was a procedural review brought forward by the Louisiana State Civil Rights Commission to assess whether probable cause existed for a formal civil suit. But everyone in that room knew it was about something far bigger than process. It was about precedent. Maya had compiled evidence with relentless care. Surveillance footage showing the officers entering Eli's home without a warrant, bodycam audio in which Officer Hole muttered, "Should have known this place was too nice for his kind," and statements from neighbors who, despite fear of backlash, had come forward to say they'd never seen Eli involved in anything criminal. One even testified he saw Eli in the fields at the exact time Holt's report claimed he was acting suspiciously near a local store. The defense argued reasonable suspicion, citing an anonymous tip that never materialized into a source. But it wasn't just the weakness of their case that spoke volumes. It was the tone. Detached, technical, unmoved. Eli, when called to the stand, didn't speak with the fiery cadence of a victim demanding justice. His voice was measured, almost quiet, as if the words he carried had been aged like oak barrels, stronger for the time they'd spent unspoken. "I didn't come here to ruin a man's career," he said plainly. "I came here because I've lived through 3 generations of this same story, and I don't want my granddaughter to live through a 4th. There wasn't a sound in the courtroom. Even the judges. Gavel paused mid-reach. Reverend Carter later said it reminded him of Dr. King's final sermon, solemn, steady, soaked in pain, but steeped in purpose. Outside the courthouse, media vans hummed and protesters waved signs bearing Eli's face and words like "farmer, not felon, and soil has memory." Maya addressed the cameras with a poise that belied her age. "My grandfather was not arrested because of who he is. He was arrested because of what his skin represents to a system still poisoned by its own past." Her words ricocheted far beyond the Louisiana border. CNN covered the story. So did the Washington Post. Hashtags trended "Justice for Eli. Not on our soil. Badge and bias." But while the country rallied, the local pressure mounted. Maya received veiled threats in her mailbox. Eli's tractor was found vandalized one morning, its tires slashed, and the words, "Stay in your row," spray painted across the barn. The sheriff's department launched an internal review, but offered no real accountability. Hole remained on administrative leave, still drawing a paycheck. Still, Eli didn't budge. "If I give in now," he told Maya, "I let them win twice. First for arresting me, then for scaring me." Silent. What followed was an unexpected flood of solidarity. Black farmers from across the South drove in to help him replant the ruined rows. Volunteers from civil rights organizations patched his barn and helped fix his tractor. Local teachers began using Eli's story in their civics classes to illustrate modern-day racism in institutions we often call just. The case was no longer a question of whether Eli had been wronged. That was evident. The question was what would be done about it. At a community town hall, a younger white woman named Elise Harrington, born and raised in Tula, stood up with trembling hands. "I used to believe this town was past all that. But now I see the roots run deeper, and if we're not the ones to pull them up, they'll keep strangling anything that tries to grow." Her words were met with applause, but also glares. Because truth in a small town is dangerous when it challenges comfort. Weeks later, the Civil Rights Commission released its findings. A formal suit would be filed against the Tula Sheriff's Department for unlawful detainment, racial profiling, and violation of constitutional rights. The Department of Justice announced it would begin its own investigation. The night of the announcement, Maya sat beside Eli on the porch again. The fields were beginning to turn golden under the summer sun, resilient in ways that mirrored their owner. "You think it'll change anything?" she asked. But didn't answer immediately. He watched the wind ripple through the stalks like a congregation swaying in prayer. "Everything," he finally said, "but maybe enough to give the next boy with hands like mine a different kind of morning." The harvest wasn't just crops that season. It was truth, hard-earned, painfully sown, and long overdue. And though the road ahead was still littered with potholes of injustice, something undeniable had shifted. For the first time in a long time, the soil of Tula bore not just the weight of history but the seeds of change. The summer sun had begun its slow descent over the horizon, casting a golden hue over the cornfields of Tallulah. The stalks swayed gently in the evening breeze, whispering stories only the land could remember. Among them stood Eli Mercer, weathered but not broken, his silhouette framed against the light like a monument carved by time. Months had passed since the courtroom hearing, yet the weight of what had ignited still hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Eli never wanted to be a symbol. All he ever wanted was peace, a good harvest, a warm porch, the laughter of his granddaughter echoing through the fields. But life doesn't always ask us who we want to be. Sometimes it chooses for us. And when injustice knocked on his door that spring morning, Eli answered, not with rage but with a quiet defiance of a man whose roots ran deeper than hate. In the aftermath of the trial, change had begun to creep into Tallulah like light through cracked shutters. The sheriff, who once turned a blind eye to Officer Holt's patterns of behavior, resigned under mounting pressure. Hull himself faced disciplinary hearings not just for Eli's unlawful arrest, but for a history of misconduct finally brought to light. The town was no longer silent. Reverend Carter's church doubled its attendance, transforming into a hub for dialogue, healing, and voter registration drives. But it wasn't the institutions that moved the needle. It was the people, neighbors who had once kept their distance, crossing fences to say, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." Teachers, including Eli's story in their lesson plans, farm supply companies offering donations to support Black-owned agricultural work, and young activists inspired by Maya's unflinching voice organizing across the county to demand policy reform. Still, amid all the noise, Eli remained Eli. He rose before dawn, fed the chickens, tended to the corn, and sat on the same porch with the same thermos of black coffee. Fame didn't change him. If anything, it sharpened his sense of purpose. His story had traveled far, New York Times articles, CNN segments, and even a feature documentary. Yet he never watched a single one. "The truth needs my face, let him use it," he told Maya. "But my work is out there in the soil." Maya, now in her final year of college, had grown into a leader in her own right. She declined summer internships in Washington to stay in Tula and help her grandfather create something he'd only whispered about before, a foundation to support young Black farmers. They called it Roots Unbroken, and its mission was clear: equip, educate, and empower the next generation of agricultural leaders often ignored by the system. Through this foundation, Eli began mentoring local youth. Teenagers once headed for trouble found purpose in planting rows of okra or learning how to rotate crops. He taught them not just how to farm, but how to carry themselves with dignity in a world too quick to dismiss them. "You got to treat this land like you treat yourself," he would say, "with patience, with care, and with pride." One afternoon, while showing 14-year-old how to repair a busted irrigation pipe, Eli paused, looking out at the horizon. "You see that line between the field and the sky?" he asked. The boy nodded. "That line's not really there. Just looks like it from here. That's how most barriers in this life work. Only real if you don't move toward." In that simple analogy, Eli distilled what generations of textbooks failed to teach: perspective, resilience, and quiet revolution. As autumn rolled in, the town gathered for the first annual Tula Community Harvest Festival. It had been Maya's idea, but the town's people had embraced it as a celebration of unity. Vendors lined the square. Music played from the church steps. And at the center of it all was Eli, his photo displayed beside a plaque that read, "A man who grew more than crops. He cultivated change." Eli said little at the event, but when Reverend Carter asked him to share a few words, he took the mic and scanned the crowd. Black, white, young, old neighbors who once avoided his gaze, now applauding him with pride. "I didn't set out to change anything," he said, "but when the world pressed down, just stood where I was planted. And sometimes that's enough to make a forest grow." The applause thundered, not because of his eloquence, but because of his truth. Weeks later, Eli passed peacefully in his sleep beneath a quilt his late wife had sewn decades earlier. The obituary didn't list degrees or titles. It simply read Eli Mercer, farmer, father, fighter, friend. His funeral drew hundreds. People traveled from as far as Atlanta and Houston. Tributes flowed from activists, senators, farmhands, and mayors alike. But the most touching eulogy came from Maya. "My grandfather never raised his voice," she said, her voice trembling yet. But the world heard him anyway. Eli's ashes were scattered over the land. He loved between rows of corn that stood taller than they ever had nourished, not just by soil, but by story. And in every stalk, every furrow, every breeze through the fields lived the Legacy of a man who showed that resistance doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes it wears overalls and holds it. The farmer was gone, but what he planted would keep growing season after season. Voice after voice, justice after justice. And that was the true harvest. The one that would never end. Eli Mercer's story is not just a narrative about one man wrongfully arrested in the middle of his cornfield. It's a chronicle of quiet strength, rooted in dignity and watered by decades of injustice endured with unshakable resolve. From the moment the cuffs clicked around his weathered wrists, the world around him began to unravel and then unexpectedly began to awaken. For decades, Eli lived a simple life in the heart of Tallulah, a farmer who asked for nothing but peace and a good harvest. Yet, his black skin became a silent target in a town still burdened by the shadows of systemic racism. When the police arrived under false pretenses with badges that shone brighter than their intentions, they didn't just arrest a man. They ignited a movement. What followed was not rage, but resistance. Not fire, but roots. Eli didn't retaliate with lawsuits or headlines. He simply stood calmly with truth on his side. It was his granddaughter Maya who turned the wheel of change. Young, fierce, and unwavering, she gave voice to what her grandfather endured in silence. And together across generations, they challenged a system that had for too long mistaken silence for submission. Their story brought out the best and worst of Tula. It revealed neighbors who had turned away for too long, but also inspired them to stand up. It unmasked corrupt officers, but also lifted community leaders into action. From church pews to courtroom benches, from local schoolhouses to national headlines, Eli's name became a symbol, not of victimhood, but of quiet revolution. But Eli never cared about fame. While the world disgusted him, returned to his field. He mentored the youth. He started roots unbroken not to punish the past, but to prepare the future. In teaching teenagers how to grow crops, he taught them how to grow character. Every seed he planted carried a deeper message. You do not need to shout to be heard. And you do not need to fight to change everything. Sometimes just standing firm where you are is enough. When he passed away, it wasn't with bitterness. It was with purpose fulfilled. The man who had been dragged from his land had reclaimed it not with force but with legacy. His granddaughter now carries his torch. His foundation continues to bloom. And Tallulah, once blind, now sees just a little clearer because of him. So what can we learn from Eli Mercer? We learn that racism isn't always loud. It's often systemic disguised and routine delivered in silence. But we also learn that dignity is more powerful than any prejudice. That wisdom doesn't scream. It whispers in the wind between cornrows. That real revolution doesn't always start in courts or Congress, but in the hearts of those who refuse to be broken. In today's world where division grows faster than unity and truth is often drowned out by noise, Eli's story reminds us that change begins quietly. In how we treat our neighbors, in what we tolerate in silence, in who we choose to stand beside when injustice walks through the door. And most importantly, we are all responsible. Whether we're Maya speaking truth to power or Eli standing grounded with grace, each of us has the chance to plant something better than what we've inherited. If this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, or even pause, then don't let it end here. Share it. Reflect on it. Talk about it with someone. Let Eli's legacy grow in your life too. If you want to hear more stories like this, real stories that shake the silence, uplift the unheard, and shine light where it's long been dark, then hit that subscribe button. Your support fuels this journey, and your voice helps amplify others like Eli, who may never speak for themselves, because sometimes the smallest seed can grow into the strongest tree. And every voice, just like every harvest, begins with one person who dares to